original or first person was the one who also wrote down the symbols of yin and yang, using these words to express them, and these symbols, the broken line and the solid line, to symbolize yin and yang. These later were developed into the 8 trigrams, and this was used as a form of this was used as a way in which to see how change took place in nature, going from yin stage to yang stage and back again. A little bit later, another man, Shinno, this developed the art of agriculture and diet, eating, how to cultivate food and how to eat properly. And a whole treaty, a whole book was developed along these lines, using yin and yang strictly in that realm of agriculture and eating. And a third one, which was more popularly known as the Yellow Emperor. You might have seen this book, The Yellow Emperor's Classic of Internal Medicine. This book is considered the Bible of Oriental medicine and in healing. And it primarily was dealing with the health and maintenance for human beings. And there's a very interesting passage in there where the Yellow Emperor, the reason they called him the Yellow Emperor, in China the yellow meant the central one, the central person. So the connotation of the Yellow Emperor was in fact then the highest emperor, the supreme leader. The Yellow Emperor is talking to his doctor, who they didn't call doctor, they called sage. The doctor was so highly revered that he was a sage. And he asked his doctor, tell me why in the ancient times, and you have to remember this conversation was taking place about 3,000 years ago, and he's asking his doctor why in ancient times people would live to be 100 years of age, full of vim and vigor, and today, for definitive terms. It was during this time that Confucius and Lao Tzu were living and began to develop their understanding, and it was also during this time that the Book of Changes, the I Ching, came out. And if you're familiar with the I Ching, they took the 8 trigrams, which is basically showing 8 different stages of nature, and they expanded it to 64, 8 times 8. So they had 64 different hexagrams in the I Ching, and each one of those hexagrams was showing a different stage of life, a different part of a whole process. If you really begin to study the book and get into it a little more, you realize that whether you're talking about physical phenomena, nature, human relationships, the cosmos, materialization, spiritualization, whatever particular aspect you're applying it to, the book's understanding of that process was very deep and very highly respected all throughout the Far East. Because, yeah.
I'm sorry, I just want to say, in your opinion, you mentioned that the Gareth
Well, he's referring, like, when people want to use the book to ask it questions or to come up with answers, there were methods. One of the methods where they took yarrow sticks, which are like little twigs. They used 40 of them, and there was a method of throwing them, and it took a process. It takes not a long time, but maybe it takes a half an hour, 40 minutes to go through the whole process. Then a not a common way, but a more modern way, and they used this also ancient times, but it was a more, let's say, faster way, was using coins. And by throwing the coins, it would come up a certain number, and then it would either be one of these lines or one of those lines. What's the difference? The difference really lies in the person doing it and the kind of attitude and mind that they have in throwing it. If somebody's really thinking like, I'll go like this, throw a couple numbers down and come up with an answer that'll square my life away, I don't think it matters what they use. They're probably not going to get the real meaning that really, one can get from anything they do with a little bit more conscientious attitude. Because, I mean, the whole thing about the Book of Changes is your interpretation. If you read the Bible, if you read any of the religious scriptures, regardless of whether it's Judaism, Christianity, Buddhism, it doesn't matter. If you read any religious scriptures, it still comes down to the interpretation of the person. Someone who has deep insight can get something very profound out of one line, one passage, one paragraph, and someone with no insight can totally misconstrue what's being said and go off in a totally opposite direction. So I think that our manner in which we read or study is as important as the message that we actually get, be it from a book or a teacher or, a person. Some people feel that the longer method is the more profound method because it sets up a more meditative stage within the person doing it, since it takes longer. During this period of time, they started to write down and incorporate much of the ancient understanding. And during this period of time, a lot of the records were written down and books were being compiled on medicine, agriculture, diet, healing, philosophy, etc., all based on the understanding of yin and yang. A lot of this understanding was also being developed and spread in other countries. In Japan, one of the ways in which the Far East spread its information was the Buddhist monks from India went to China. In China, they introduced Buddhism. And at that time, they brought ancient Indian medicine to China. And while they were in China, they then learned Chinese medicine. Then they took Chinese medicine and they went to Japan, where they introduced Buddhism. And at the same time, they introduced a lot of Chinese culture. At that time, China and Japan, of course, were aware of each other, but there wasn't a whole lot of migration or communication going back and forth. The Buddhist monks were more or less the bridge by which the various cultures started to share different types of information. Prior to that, Japan did not have any books. I don't mean that they didn't have any written books. They didn't have any what we would call great books. There was no Bible in Japan, like in the West. There was no great philosophical book. There was no great healing book, like, the Yellow Emperor's Classic. They did not compile and utilize their information in that way. More or less, Japan had three basic ways in which they were practically using in their day-to-day life. They were using diet, they were using fasting, they were using prayer. Those three methods were the main ways in which they were helping to cure and heal people. Then they started to incorporate Oriental medicine and began to also use the words yin and yang and began to apply Oriental medicine, which actually then came out to be Japanese medicine, because everything the Japanese do, no matter where it comes from, it comes out Japanese. But one of the things that they do very well is they assimilate incredibly well. So they take in, and then when it comes back out, it always has a particular Japanese flavor to it. So there was quite a unique background and understanding in the Far Eastern cultures. But one of the ways in which they went to explain yin and yang a little bit further was in the use of the 5 transformations, 5 stages of change. This is not necessarily more complicated. In fact, once you start to see the pattern, you realize that what it is giving it definition. You start to see yin and yang in a different stage. Of course, the most obvious way to see this is in the seasons, in the changing seasons. And Yin Yang Go Kyo. This was referring to the changes in nature, the transfer.